All right. So just a quick recap of what we talked about in chapter 1. Chapter 1 was about avoiding spiritual presuppositions, and there were the biggest one being philosophical naturalism. Obviously the idea that nothing outside of the physical universe is considered in any kind of explanatory power. One of the best examples that I think that he gave in the book is these dangerous presuppositions for jurors as well as for truth seekers, like nothing exists outside the natural realm, or that supernatural explanations must be eliminated. That one's actually really important for today, which you'll see in just a moment. But the other thing that he talks about in chapter 1 is this checklist for examining cases and trying to just make sure that there aren't any presuppositions that might be blocking possible explanations for cases when he's out on a homicide investigation. So this week we'll be looking at inferences and abductive reasoning. Did you get a chance to read the chapter? You're probably like halfway through the book already.
Somewhat. Third or fourth chapter.
So in this chapter, the example was looking at a murder case that had to do with a child, and obviously the first conclusion that they just jumped to with all these presuppositions was that the parents had neglected the child, and that jumping to those conclusions led to the wrong conclusion about the case. In fact, the dad loved his son, and so this example is for thinking abductively and drawing the most reasonable conclusions, which has a lot to do actually with the idea that they talk about with jurors when selecting a jury for reasonable doubt versus possible doubt, and that epistemological standard for reasoning. Because possible doubt, like you said with the Rube Goldberg machine idea, I mean that's such a high epistemological standard that there's no way you could even adjudicate or arrive at a conclusion in a case.
Well, and even beyond that, I think you can't even operate in life with that standard.
Right, because there are just so many conceivable possible explanations, no matter how absurd. Nevertheless, they're not necessarily the likely explanation for the situation. So this week's chapter really kind of had two sides. The first part was about inferring and abductive reasoning. Were you familiar with abductive reasoning and how it contrasts with inductive and deductive reasoning?
On a practical basis, yes, but on an intellectual frame, no. That wasn't a term that I was really familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not really commonly talked about, which I think is why he uses more the language of inference, inferential logic. Have you ever read Sherlock Holmes?
I haven't read it, but I'm familiar with it.
I think you would really enjoy Sherlock Holmes, just knowing your personality and the type of things you're interested in. But one of the things that frustrates me about Sherlock Holmes is his ego and how absolute he considers his deductive logic. And he'll walk through the steps of his deductive logic. It's no, that's abductive logic. You slow your roll there, Sherlock. You're not that smart. Chill out, bro. The first book, if he's going through all these steps, and he's it's simple deductive logic. There's no other explanation. It's Sure. Okay. I mean, yeah, that is ultimately of course, by the hand of the author. But
Yeah.
anyway, it kind of cracks me up how so arrogantly confident he is in his deductive logic, even though it's nowhere near deductive. It's far more abductive, but nevertheless. Anyway, so what we're going to do now is I wanted to make sure I have internet access, and then there's a 11-minute video with the author, J. Warner Wallace, talking about the first and second chapters. So we'll take a look at that, and then we'll discuss the conspiracy theories for the resurrection, because that was the second half of this chapter. So let me get this going. Make sure the volume is up. Oh, that is really up. Maybe we'll stick to 45. There we go. And where'd my play button go? Man, nothing wants to work for me today. Have you guys ever used Right Now Media? This is
Occasionally.
Yeah, that's where this is. So the next one also covers the third and fourth chapter, thinking circumstantially and testing your witnesses. So we'll take a look at the next video for after chapter 4. But yeah, check that out if you ever get a chance. I can put a link to it. In fact, that's what I'll do. I'll put a link to it on the Defender's website so that it's just easier to find.
It's interesting. I think I've shared with you guys before, but Andrew Clayton was a writer and movie producer and so on. He came to Christ, and it's a very interesting perspective on a lot of things and stuff. A very deep thinker. But it's interesting how he came to Christ. Was talking about the presupposition of nothing outside of the physical. He was married and stuff, and had newlyweds move in next door across the way, and they didn't have curtains, and they did what newlyweds tend to do, and he made some comment to his wife about how disgusting that was. And she says, well, that's what we do. And he's like, oh, that's different. And she's like, well, how? And it got him to thinking that there's more than the physical, and just how there has to be more, because the difference between seeing that and what he experienced with his wife, there was a metaphysical element of that, and just how there had to be something more, and that's what eventually brought him to Christ. And I thought that was interesting. It just kind of related to me that the presupposition, and just until you have that thrown in your face, sometimes it takes something like that for us to get past our presuppositions.
So one thing that I thought was really interesting about this chapter, and I really appreciated it, was kind of this list of criteria for the explanatory power of evidence and circumstances. We talked a little bit about this in On Guard with regard to premises and sentential logic and syllogisms and things like that. And this is very similar and kind of runs along the same lines with, the truth must be feasible. It's usually straightforward. That probably will remind you of Occam's razor. You know, often the most simple explanation is the correct one. The truth should be exhaustive, the truth must be logical, and the truth will be superior. One thing that I was thinking about as I was reading through this were other philosophical razors, like the Sagan standard. Have you heard this?
The term. Anyway.
Extraordinary evidence requires extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. What do you think about that? Like, with regards to kind of what we're looking at here, with the type of evidence and arriving at certain conclusions, like a miracle, for example, and examining all the conspiracy theories around the resurrection. Or, in fact, J. Warner Wallace actually uses this same illustration with the evidence and the conclusions that you arrive at with the cosmological argument. In fact, on Defenders, the Casemakers course that accompanied the book doesn't quite follow the book exactly, but it does sort of parallel it. And in the video about the cosmological argument, he uses this exact same illustration where if he actually adds the element of the room. So if you find a man lying face down in a pool of his own blood with a knife in his back and multiple stab wounds, the cause of this dead man could not be something from inside the room. Like, it couldn't be a suicide, it couldn't be an accident, it couldn't be a natural death. Obviously it's not a natural death because he's got a knife in his back. So like the knife is evidence that points to something outside the room. So like with the cosmological argument, it must be something outside the room of our universe. But anyway, back to the Sagan standard. What do you think about? Like, have you heard that? Have you heard that claim?
I heard the claim.
Like, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
It reminds me of politics right now.
How so?
There's years ago, was more naive, and a lot of these conspiracy theories, the JFK stuff, and so on. Man didn't, or the moon was fake, the moon landing was fake, stuff like that. Just crazy people. But as I see more and more evidence of the lies in politics, and you see that the buildup of these evidence and these different things, it makes those claims and others much more believable, because you see the deception, you see through the lies and stuff, and you see that, and so it makes a regression to be able to see that maybe that's not so far-fetched after all. So, kind of a different way of seeing things.
Yeah, and that's I think that's a good segue into what J. Warner Wallace does with this illustration, where he compares the two possible explanations. Either Jesus rose from the dead or Jesus didn't rise from the dead. Those are the only two explanations that can account for the facts. The facts were, there's an empty tomb. The disciples believed that, Jesus had risen. There's all these facts. How do we explain these facts? Well, if you compare these two explanations, one of them has only one roadblock, that supernaturalism is impossible, and the other has roadblock after roadblock after roadblock after roadblock. Now, to be fair, I would say that these roadblocks aren't necessarily equal. So, like you can see on here that supernaturalism is impossible. Is that is it fair to maybe draw that roadblock the same size as the fact that they were wrong, or the possibility that they were wrong, or the possibility that they were lying, or the possibility of whatever? Like, for a non-believer, supernaturalism being impossible would be this enormous wall compared to all these much smaller, easier to navigate barriers. However, I think the point still stands that as J. Warner Wallace said in the video, that there's no greater efficient explanation, meaning that there's only one roadblock there. That's the only roadblock, and if you don't have that presupposition, then there is no roadblock, and it does account for all of the details. Whereas, if Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then this is perhaps a modest illustration of the litany of problems in trying to explain what happened, given the evidence that we have for the resurrection of Jesus.
One thing that came to mind with this chapter and stuff is with abductive reasoning is the additive power.
Yeah.
And they, one may not be convincing, but, 3 is pretty persuasive. 5 is like, yeah, okay, that's pretty, it's just, it adds on to itself. And it's the weight of all of these together.
Yeah.
Rather than just the significance of one particular item.
Yeah, that's true. It does have kind of a cumulative power. It's not just, a bunch of independent facts, but like as these facts, as you go through these facts, it has cumulative, corroborative power. Was there any of these conspiracy theories that you found to be more compelling than others?
The one that I think Scott was just kind of referencing, where you have and I think it was number 5 or 6, where you had a couple individuals that convinced other individuals, and that's how it spread.
Oh, the imposter theory?
It's like, I don't know if I've heard that one.
Yeah, that one was new to me as well.
Like, because so I started thinking about that and the possibilities of that. And if you look at other world religions, let's take Mormonism for example, the evidences aren't reasonable when you stack them together, but they don't look at that, they look at belief only, which is crazy, but it's all this person told this person, that person convinced this person. It's like, okay, so can that be plausible for Christianity? And he talks about it in references. I think that one's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting. I hadn't really, given it much credence, but that example of Mormonism, it's like, that is an interesting example of that.
And that's only been the last 150 years. Christianity's been around for 2,000.
Yeah.
And everybody nowadays doesn't have access to the physical Christ, right, or the apostles or any of that. So it's all off of non-physical things, reading and feelings and supernatural. And we have evidences that we can look at as well, historical evidences. So that was an interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges for learning the material in this, for having a ready defense for an apologetic, is that there's just so many, facts to cover. Like, going through all of these theories, there's lists of problems and liabilities that each theory has. So I think for the benefit of having a ready defense, perhaps the best foundation would be establishing the facts. And that's one of the things that I really appreciate about reasonable faith is that the focus is more on these facts, namely Jesus died and was buried. That's a historically established fact. The tomb was empty. That's a historically established fact. The disciples claimed to see Jesus resurrected, and they were transformed to the point where they were willing to die because they were so convinced that this was true. You know, no one would be willing to die for something that they secretly knew was a lie. And so for the purposes of having a ready defense for, you know, these various conspiracy theories, I think the best approach would be to solidify your understanding of these 4 facts. Really, I think 3 and 4 are kind of the same. You know, the disciples claimed to see Jesus resurrected, and they were transformed. In my mind, is kind of 2 sides of the same coin for that historical fact. But yeah, having a solid foundation in these 3 historical facts: Jesus died and was buried, the tomb was empty, and the disciples claimed to see Jesus resurrected, and they were so transformed that they were willing to die for their beliefs.
I think I would add another on that was nobody was ever produced.
Right. Well, that would be the empty tomb. The tomb was empty. No one ever produced a body.
I think that's an additional.
Mm-hmm.
Is that not only was the tomb empty, but nobody was able to produce.
Nobody produced no body. Right. Yeah, because there's a lot of. I mean, when you're looking at the problems with these conspiracy theories, what you're doing is you're comparing them against the evidence, namely these 4 historical facts. And he talks about the minimal facts approach offered by Gary Habermas and Michael Licona, which hopefully those names will sound familiar. Michael Licona was one of the editors of the Evidence for God book that we studied in the last 2 semesters. But yeah, the minimal facts approach is the aspects of the resurrection story most scholars and experts, and J. Warner Wallace cited about 70% of scholarship accepts those facts. And that's really important because then the minimal facts leads to less temptation to appeal to things that can't really be supported, evidence that can't really be supported. These minimal facts are all facts that are strongly, agreed upon by scholarship. So with that, we're approaching time. Were there any other questions or comments? Any further discussion about chapter 2 and
I would say, to my mind, I don't think he did a particularly great job of defining abductive reasoning. I went to Wikipedia and stuff and looked up some other stuff as far as definitions of that, and it was clarified much better than his description of it.
Yeah, it seemed his approach is more based on example and using illustrations to demonstrate, through example rather than explicit definition of abductive reasoning.
Yeah, it was number 5 is the one I was referencing. The disciples were influenced by limited spiritual sightings. So they say, more recently, some skeptics have offered the theory that 1 or 2 of the disciples had a vision of the risen Christ and then convinced the others that these spiritual sightings are legitimate. It's quite literally the Mormon story and the Muslim story. There's so many things and evidences we have that prove that wrong for Christianity. But outside of those, after the apostles are dead and stuff, I can maybe kind of see that, but that doesn't explain the 500 that saw Christ and all the 40 days and everything else. But
and the missing corpse and the empty tomb.
yeah. But for other religions, that one, number 5 nailed a hit for a lot of the other ones.
Mhm.
It's like,
Right. Yeah, like I said last week, I think when it comes to abductive reasoning and identifying the most reasonable explanation given the evidence, I've heard a few different illustrations, and perhaps my favorite one is the box of cereal, because it demonstrates abductive reasoning that we just use on an ordinary everyday basis. You go to the grocery store, you want to buy a box of cereal, you go to the cereal aisle, you find a box, and it's possible that it could be full of sawdust. It's possible it could be full of metal shavings, but is that reasonable? It's possible that it could be filled with some heavy gas that happens to feel like cereal in there. You shake it, it sounds like cereal. It's possible, but it's not reasonable. Another example that I've heard from a judge actually was when he talks to jurors. He says, you drove here this morning, you parked your car before you came in, and let's say that you need to get your oil changed, and you looked at the odometer and it shows 50,000 miles, and you're like, yeah, I need to get a tune-up or whatever. So you made a mental note of that. Is it possible that while you're here in the courthouse being lectured by me to be on this jury, that your car was not there the whole time, that maybe it's been driven hundreds of miles? Is that reasonable? Well, if you go out to your car and you check the odometer and it still says 50,000 miles, that would be reasonable to conclude that no, your car didn't go anywhere. Well, maybe what if it's possible that somebody loaded your car up onto a tow truck, a flatbed tow truck, and drove it around for thousands of miles and came back and offloaded it just in time for you to come out and go back to your car? Is that reasonable? It's possible, but it's not reasonable. Right, so
I think that kind of brings to mind the the idea, whatever, of framing someone for a crime.
yeah,
You take some absurd approach like that to make it look like, because you don't consider the absurd.
mm-hmm.
And so, that kind of covers their tracks without actually having to cover their track, just because the virtue of the absurdity of the premise. And so, that's one thing to keep in mind if you want to frame someone.
All right.
The abductive reasoning too,
Mhm.
with regard to the abiogenesis. I was reading something just this morning or last night about the scarcity of proteins within the search space available. And one author one researcher had put together the requirements for proteins within the cell, for the first cell, and the requirement for the minimum genome, basically, for it. And he came up with a number of chance of 1 in 10 to the 100 trillionth power.
Well, at least it's only one level deep. It's not like exponent upon exponent upon exponent. It's only one level.
That's how it got there. But it was.
But hey, it's possible.
Yes, yeah.
Just needed time.
Yeah. But
kidding.
it was an example of the abductive reasoning of just the stack up and the this one on top of 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 this one, just how they multiply and stack up to the absolute absurdity.
That's it. Yeah, it's interesting. Like, I joke about it. They say that a lot. We're just given time, but it's not just time. I mean, if you have nothing, nowhere,
Well,
doesn't matter
it,
how much
pre-
time you
it
have.
presupposes the infinitude of the universe, which there's overwhelming evidence that the universe is not infinite. There is a specific amount of time. So that just completely ignores a key aspect of the claim, namely that there is a finite amount of time for this to have occurred.
Well, and, we think of time in reference to our existence, our lives, and our experience. And to us, that, 4.5 billion years is infinite.
It's true.
But in terms of
The time required for
time
this specific
required
thing.
and not just the time required, because the time is a double-edged sword,
Mhm.
because there's time for processes to occur, but there's also entropy
Mhm.
along with that, which operates over time. And so, you have possibility of something being created, but you also have the inevitable and inexorable degradation of everything over time.
Mhm.
And so, it's a double-edged sword. But, with numbers like that, all the particles in the known universe 10 to the 57th power. So 10 to the 100 trillionth power.
Yeah. Not only do you need time, but you also need the elements.
Materials.
You need
Right,
something to put it
right.
together, something to put it together correctly.
Yeah.
Somewhere for it to live, somewhere for it to be protected and fed. And
Well, and to Scott's point, the time's a double-edged sword, because on one hand you need the time to make the forward progress, but the time also provides an overwhelming amount of likelihood for destruction. So it's like a finely balanced thing that could very easily and would very easily fall apart.
Well, it's not finely balanced. Without God's intervention,
Right.
there's no balance there. Entropy is a fact.
Mhm.
That's one of the most basic laws of all of nature. And the idea that's never really been exhibited or proven is that stuff violates entropy and stuff self-organizes into these processes.
Mhm.
Okay, that's never been proven. But here we have entropy on the other side that is absolute and proven, and we experience it and we understand it, and it's a part of our basic understanding of the universe. So I wouldn't say there's a balance there.
Well, I just mean that it's delicate. Like, the progress is delicate. Because to your point of the double-edged sword, given enough time for that progress to take place, it's fragile. And the other side of the double-edged sword of time would be the overwhelming probability that delicate progress would be hindered and in fact diminished by entropy and other things.
Yeah, but my point is that, that progress is fanciful and
True.
and
Assuming that it is true.
imaginary and
Yeah,
assumed.
assuming, hypothetically, yeah. Right. I'm really curious to see what J. Warner Wallace has to say about this in his book, God's Crime Scene. So he actually uses these same principles. Like I said, he talks about this very same illustration of, the guy lying face down in a pool of blood with a knife in his back, multiple stab wounds, about the cosmological argument, the origin of the universe. And so, his other book, God's Crime Scene, looks at these cosmological concepts. I wonder if abiogenesis and evolution and DNA and things like that might also be mentioned in there. But I imagine that would probably be the case for that book. It'd be interesting to check that out. But this week we'll be reading chapter 3, which is Thinking Circumstantially, and I'm looking forward to reading it. I hope you are too. Anybody like to close us in prayer?
Sure. Dear God, we just come before you now, and we're thankful that you have provided the tools and the evidence that we can rely on, that we don't have to just rely on blind faith, God, that it is reasonable, that it is the most logical and the most discernible evidence that Christ is risen and the Gospels are true. God, we remind of Romans, it talks about people are without excuse because you have made yourself known through creation. God, we just thank you for that, but we thank you too that you've gone beyond that and that you've touched our lives personally and given us a hint of your character and your love through our personal experiences and through the ways that you have touched our lives. And we're grateful for all of that, and that we can be certain of your existence, of your love, of your providence, and we're just so grateful. And God, we just pray that you would use our intellect to help us to show others these things and be able to, if not convince, at least to plant a seed that will help people to turn to you and find you and repent. And we just pray this all through Christ. Amen.